Chapter 2, Jaded Before Marrying Day. On the evening of my wedding rehearsal in July 1986, I was joking around with my groomsmen. Apparently, the church-assigned wedding coordinator was trying to get my attention, and I did not hear her. Someone in the room had said something directly to her, and she blurted out matter-of-factly, "He ain't ready. He's not going to make it," as if to say my marriage was doomed before it started, and that it would fail because of me. I remember asking for clarification, stating, "What did you say?" She simply hurried us along, and what I can only presume was a waste of her time. The wedding coordinator, Jade, had always been outspoken. She was an overweight woman, about 5'7". Her voice was laced with a satirical dullness from coordinating many weddings over the years. Jade was older than me, in her mid-40s, never married, with 2 children out of wedlock, while I was in my mid-20s with no children. Of course, this act of attempted emasculation put some momentary unease in the room, but not enough to spoil anyone's evening other than mine. I remember thinking how emboldened she seemed, prancing around the church sanctuary and stealing this joy from my occasion. My groomsmen, soon-to-be wife, and other members of the wedding party heard Jade, but likely could not assign significant weight to what she had said. Jade was just old enough and from a well-established family in that church that she could get away with such a remark. My inner voice battled furiously with not becoming consumed with a remark I believe was so beneath me, and besides that, any further protest would have derailed the rehearsal. Most of the people at the rehearsal had come there directly from work and wanted to get in, out, and back home. Finally, Jade was holding a card she had not played, which, if she had wanted to use it, would have given her an alibi. I was only trying to get his attention. Hear me out. What Jade said spoke voluminously in my ears, but was not the kind of thing I wanted to toss a hand grenade into to blow up in a wedding rehearsal. She had the power to call off the rehearsal and possibly the wedding at the church if the pastor, known for being no-nonsense, draconian, and ready to make an example of anyone out of line, had sided with her. There was no way I was going to call all our guests and announce that the venue had changed on short notice. Any further protests with her might have revealed an immaturity in me and given her license to say, "Yes, I said it. He ain't ready." The wedding location at the church was at stake. Otherwise, I would have found myself on the steps of the Alameda County Courthouse exchanging vows in front of the Justice of the Peace if I had blown the situation up during the rehearsal. Nonetheless, I heard Jade's voice repeatedly replaying in my head until finally I said to myself, "Put on a smile." That was my remedy. What I wanted Jade to do was play the card she was holding and say, "I was joking. I was just trying to get your attention. I wish you success in your new life." Those words would have demonstrated some respect and publicly restored my masculine image, but that never happened. She left the ice pick stuck in my chest. I pulled it out and found my way forward in a marriage for 20 years by trial and error. The idea of being jaded before marrying day is actually a metaphor. However, in this case, Jade was a real person. This chapter is about the self-deceptive harms we inflict on ourselves through ignorance, impulsivity, and inexperience, which cause damage to a marriage before it even starts. I can only speculate about what made Jade salty, but perhaps this chapter holds some answers for men and women, perhaps even some generational wisdom traditions that can be passed along from people who had to pull an ice pick out of their chest. Today, people are asking, why get married? Why risk failure if you do not have to? Marriage was established as a divine institution with origins in the Judeo-Christian tradition. If a person does not subscribe to the accountability of those traditions, then why get married? Companionship and all its benefits can be achieved without marriage, and even having children is possible. Why do modern men and women ask this question? From a pastor's perspective, I think it's because fewer people in these last days subscribe to religious traditions. Secondly, I think people are more consumer oriented and transactional than they were 2,000 years ago. Ancient people had more necessities to secure, such as working the farmland or managing a fishing boat, which guided marriage decisions, including whom to marry. Today, there is a supply and demand dynamic in the relationship marketplace, which simply put means women outnumber men. Finally, women are more independent than ever and quick to let men know they don't need their help. The emergence of strong, independent women has let men off the hook, so to speak, and given them cause to take their time before settling down, if settling down is in their DNA. The DNA in some men finds a strong, independent woman hard to deal with because she possesses tools men have used to make covenants with women for millennia. So these men feel displaced when a woman demonstrates she can navigate the world alone without a man. I experienced displacement only once in my life when I was in my early 20s. I had met and successfully charmed my way into the phone number of a chart-topping R&B star who went on to have a successful career and achieve platinum album success. We'll call her Eve Love. Eve Love and I met at one of her record signings in Berkeley, California, back in December of 1979. I did not know she would be in the store that day. I dropped my friend off at the entrance of the record store, and he had walked in while I was parking the car. Upon entering, he walked back to the rear of the store where the artist was signing albums. He stood around for a moment, listening to the artist interact with fans. 5 or so minutes passed before I entered the store. He said, when I walked in, she looked up, spotted me, and finally said, "Who is that?" My friend rushed over to me before I could reach the back of the store, grabbed me by the arm, led me back toward the entrance, out of the celebrity's view. He began to tell me that Eve Love was in the store and that she had just locked in on me from way back in the corner where she was signing albums. I said, "Are you sure? What do you mean? How could that be?" Maybe I look like someone she knows and she made a mistake. This friend and I were commuter students who rode to San Francisco State University every day as undergraduate students. We partied together and discussed our woman problems. That day, he assured me that he heard an excitement in her voice when she saw me. I walked back into the store with the confidence men get from Viagra. That's hyperbole. I don't use Viagra. This was going to be a layup in a basketball drill, and true to form, it was because we talked and she invited me to a party the next evening that was a part of her tour. There were people in the music industry there that she had to greet and be introduced to and to talk to, so I had to wait. It was not the evening I had planned, but eventually we got to dance, even slow dance, talk, and spend some time together. When we were together talking, I was thinking to myself, this is going to be my next girlfriend. She seemed to be having a good time, so I got her phone number, waited a week, and started calling. I called regularly for a whole month, only to reach her assistant, who was nice but would tell me she was working on tour, not available, or that she would let her know that I had called again. I gathered from the assistant that Eve Love was not trying to ditch me. She was simply an independent working woman who had to parcel out her time. This was very frustrating, deflating, and I eventually stopped calling after a couple of months. Eve Love was tending her own garden, which was her career, and a thought we will revisit later in the chapter. There was something in me that wanted her to submit to me in the form of her giving me time without me needing to compete with her other interests. This is a dilemma for many men because as men, we project on to a woman an expectation that their interest in us should cause them to submit to us as other women do. However, let's hypothetically conduct an autopsy from the perspective of a marriage to Eve Love. What was the cause of death, divorce? Waiting, standing in the shadow of her career, suppressing true feelings, prioritizing other people over me, accusations that I interfered with her progress, and finally, too much alone time with my thoughts. Marriage, when it fails, is the great tell-all. Marriage is our unapologetic snitch. Seemingly, marriage in its own de facto way objectively exposes us for who we are in character. There is no judgment with this exposure, as marriage is, in and of itself, a neutral institution, a legal document printed on paper. However, the marriage union of people reveals so much about their flaws, faults, and functions. Those of us who have been married and divorced have one thing in common. We had blind spots. As thoroughly as we thought we might have investigated the other person, we missed something that was staring us right in the face. Or in some cases, we turned a blind eye. We saw something, but we could not bring ourselves to believe it, so we made excuses for it. The status of being Eve Love's boyfriend was intoxicating enough to tempt me to turn a blind eye and endure some of the waiting, that is, if I had been willing to ignore that second-class feeling. Marriage may very well be the most self-deceiving of all of life's engagements, which unfortunately involves someone else who has to endure our own and their own simultaneous self-deception. It is a fact that for the most part that men are unable to deter the thought and urge of projecting onto women and convincing themselves that a woman, just based on her physical attractiveness alone, comes equipped with the necessary character traits and skill sets that will make her a good future wife. Lustfully, men rationalize that a woman is going to be a good wife because she's pretty by their measures. Conversely, many women often deceive themselves into believing a height requirement for potential husbands reflects the man's character or ability to be a good partner and provider. Strikingly, when you are young, no one sees the agape love that will be needed in subsequent years to get through cancer, caring for an autistic child born to the union, diabetes, loss of job, weight gain, erectile dysfunction, alcoholism, infidelity, gambling addiction, decline in income, arrests, glaucoma, and terminal illness. Eve Love had a gentle presence. When I looked into her eyes, I could see that she saw me, but not the way I saw us fitting together. While soft-spoken, she saw her life through the lens and immediacy of her career, which took her to new heights shortly after we met. So, in a sense, men like me were more like an accessory to her. Accessory, not in the negative sense, but in a prioritized, practical way that was secondary to her career. Accessories have to match and fit, while not overshadowing the main garment. Men who grew up with a father in the home and who watch the loving relationship between mom and dad have a good chance of supporting one side of a marriage's future success. It should be noted that just because a man grew up in a home with loving parents as his role models does not automatically confer perfection on him or a successful marriage. I point this out because men who have no role models have a harder road to travel, but those who had loving parents have some idea of what is supposed to happen in a marriage. However, if you marry Eve Love and your mother was not forging a love relationship contemporaneously with a drive for strong independence as a career woman, then it would be as if you had no role model at all. You would be projecting the expectations you admired in your mother onto Eve Love, and you would never find what you were looking for in a wife in that particular woman. However, it is a tremendous blessing if the two people considering marriage have a relationship with God and His Word prior to their marriage. Two people who have learned to pray, be reflective, and be accountable to God have something to build on. Even if your family passed along to you something seemingly as insignificant as having the ability to forgive according to the scriptures, it's a valuable trait to bring into a new marriage. Marriage requires everything from you, so every little bit helps. The other 50% of the marital union depends on how the woman presents herself, how she grew up, what she believes constitutes a marriage, and whether she grew up with loving parents in the home and received wise advice. Again, men who do not grow up with a father in the home are, more often than not, clueless or left to their own devices to wisely put together a patchwork of what they can borrow from in the form of character traits from role model males they have known to try out in a marriage. Streaming sources, movies, and television from years gone by have generally not provided meaningful examples and imagery that men could aspire to. Even The Cosby Show, which was lauded for its positivity, was not relatable to a large segment of the male population in this country. Cliff Huxtable was a doctor in the first episode of The Cosby Show. When viewers tuned in and were introduced to Dr. Huxtable, he was already a success. We meet him midstream in his career. The backstory of Dr. Huxtable's self-discipline and endurance through medical school would have been a more desirable role modeling story for clueless men. The story of how Cliff Huxtable became a doctor and met Claire Huxtable is likely the more relatable one to this swath of the male population who lack the role models for how to conduct themselves in a marriage. These are things I wish my father had said to me that I learned from being a pastor, from experiencing a divorce, from cumulative years of conversations with former husbands and wives, and from the wisdom accumulated over the years from the scriptures, which have been indispensable. The acquisition of wisdom is necessary before two people enter into a marriage. I have known people who were in love with the idea of love and romance who would not settle for anything less than a fairy tale and a happily ever after for their marriage. When men are not grounded in biblical truth or in the treasure of accumulated wisdom from generations past, they deceive themselves and defraud their fiancés or brides-to-be. There are no guarantees that knowledge of biblical truth will lead to 100% success in a marriage, but the alternative is cluelessness and experimentation. I met a woman my age in her early 30s, a doctoral level psychologist who, in my approximation, believed extraordinarily that she had the gifts and could manifest such an outcome as near perfect love in a marriage. This was evident from the energy she poured into writing books on relationships and marriage. Starla and I had become chummy. We met at a conference she was hosting for a successful grant she had written, where I was one of the theme speakers on drug prevention. She was an attractive, petite woman with long black hair that most women envy. While I was certain she was African American, I sometimes noticed a hint of Polynesian ancestry in her phenotype. Starla was a brilliant psychologist, and that brilliance would come through in some of our soul-bearing conversations where she would gently hold up a mirror to help me diagnose my own deficiencies in a non-judgmental way. We had many of the same interests regarding documentary filmmaking in Hollywood. After a year or so of working together, I had learned a lot about her. The one thing I knew for sure about Starla was that her emotional intelligence and empathy quotient EQ were very high. She caught things I missed about people while possessing great emotional intelligence and empathy. She also retained some of Eve Love's self-reliance and strong independence, which, for her, would require a man who could respectfully intersect with her world while maintaining his own independent wholeness. There's a difference between intersecting and integrating into a spouse's world, with the former being negotiated points of common togetherness and the latter being interdependence. Negotiating points of common togetherness means you go on vacation together if you find a week on your separate calendars when you are both free to travel. Interdependence is two people working from a single synchronized calendar because they intentionally want their free weeks to coincide. When I learned she had met someone she thought was marriage material, I would sometimes offer her advice based on my trial and error marital experiences at the time, but she always over-romanticized her responses to my answers. I understood the subtlety of her resistance because who wants to glean wisdom in the wake of someone else's trials and errors? However, I recall it being hard to look into her starry eyes and seeing what I believe were blind spots and future pains. In my bones, I knew Starla was headed in the direction of accumulating a collection of her own trial and error stories rather than the fairy tale she had hoped for. She attended a great church where she met the perfect man of her dreams, who also happened to be a minister. I used to tell her I thought she was preacher wife material, so I was hopeful for this union, as I could sense excitement in her and the tide of our friendship changed appropriately. Rightfully, the gentleman she was marrying wanted to set new boundaries with her male friends, but he was unfortunately rude, arrogant, and defensive, so in short order I found an exit from their lives. If my recollection is correct, he had come from an intact home of both mother and father, so he was likely playing out some version of learned behavior from his father. Starla and I had, at the time, what I thought was a genuinely close friendship. So as she shared details about her relationship and wedding plans, I thought it would be wise to point her in the direction that would help her stay grounded in truth. I genuinely wanted her marriage to be successful. I recall on a number of occasions saying, "You really need to read your Bible because what I'm hearing from you is not grounded in truth." While her future husband had presumably come from an intact family, she had not. Starla's father had apparently been absent from her life, as evidenced by her lavish praise for her mother's amazing single parenting sacrifices and accomplishments, with not even a mention of her dad. It was glaring to me that my psychologist friend had mysteriously disabled us from any discussion about her father, as I came to understand that those discussions were off limits, which only widened the void for me to speculate. What was driving this woman to romanticize the fairy tale so badly? It was overly romanticizing to the point that she romanticized the love out of romance. Was she trying to compensate for something her mother had lost or suffered in the relationship with her father? She had a penchant for projecting onto God the sum total of her Bible knowledge so that, in the end, it would sound as if the Lord had ordained her dreams, desires, thoughts, hopes, goals, ambitions, aspirations, and vision board items. Full disclosure, I do not know if she had a vision board. That was hyperbole. When a person has been as successful as Starla has been in her career, they can sometimes become deluded by those successes, and then it hits them hard while they're in a marriage that the marriage experience is unlike anything they have ever experienced before. People learn that the skill sets that forge strong independence and career do not necessarily transfer over into the arena of marriage problem solving. As a Bible reader, any story you read in the scriptures where people were married, you discover immediately in each story there is a test of character, a hurdle for the marriage to overcome that cannot be avoided or solved by worldly means. Once we have gone through one of these tests, we have an epiphany that these tests require prayer, patience, and the performance of faith at the appropriate time God has called for it. Couples seeking to get married should be told to expect tests in a marriage with the understanding that their marriage will be no different than the marriages in the pages of the Bible. The institution of marriage was designed by God for a man and a woman to fulfill specific spiritual roles in the Garden of Eden. The first marriage established a transcultural institution. As a theological term, transcultural refers to something that does not originate from or derive its structure or value from any culture at any time on earth, but is rooted outside the earth. Therefore, Adam and Eve received their two distinct assignments before culture as we know it came into existence. Moreover, the advent of communal living did not alter the original assignments they received from God Himself, who is the source, resource, and authority over the marriage union. God handed over to humanity a very simple construct for marriage. From the beginning, it was not God's intention for marriage to be complex, burdensome, and certainly not a power struggle or a platform that applauds the strong independence of a wife. God's version of Adam was fully masculine as opposed to our aforementioned Jade's version of a man who is open game for emasculation. Even without a husband, Jade's attacking feminine nature was that of the woman in Genesis 3:16b, where it is stated, "You will desire to control your husband, but he will rule over you." God created a garden, formed a man from the earth, created a helper from the man's rib, and instructed him to tend the garden. God commanded the man to eat from any tree, even the tree of life, but not the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In the garden, there was no stress, hunger, monotony, boredom, tiredness from labor, burdens, loneliness, fear, guilt, debate, competition, hours in a day to get things done by deadline, negativity, or violence. Eden was paradise. My experiences with Jade, Eve, Love, and Starla would not have convinced me that any of these women, at the time that I was acquainted with them, would have sought to mold their understanding of marriage on the principles presented in the Genesis narrative in the garden. In most modern relationships that lead up to marriage, both men and women avoid any adherence to the simplicity of God's original construct for marriage. Most men and women ignore the idea that God stipulated for a wife's role as being led by and submissive to her husband, as stated in Genesis chapter 3, verse 16, and Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22 and 24. In chapter 14 of this book, I offer an exhaustive explanation of why the roles assigned to Adam and Eve persist today. The complexity in marriage came after Adam's fall, When, after eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, certain judgments were decreed on both him and his wife, when the Apostle Paul foretold a future in which people would forbid marriage in the last days, it was given to him by God the Holy Spirit, who in his infinite wisdom revealed how incompatible we have become today with the simplicity of marriage as an institution founded on purity and perfection in the garden. Let me provide one poignant example. An overwhelming number of couples engage in premarital sex all the way up to their wedding day, which according to Scripture is strictly forbidden. Why? Because modern people have been rejecting and altering the original construct, then pretending they did not remold the institution by denying any impact of the aforementioned behavior. It is a grave error, even a sin, to alter the original design of something God constructed, then remake it into something more desirable for ourselves, then fraudulently operate as though the premarital sexual relations did not alter the original design. I only cited premarital sexual relations, but there are many other alterations we have put into effect to accommodate our cultural norms. Why? Because we do not trust the wisdom of God in the Scriptures and see no consequence with succumbing to the desires, emotions, and sensations we believe to be overwhelming or loving. Why again? Because we see no harm in the rationalization that we make love because we are in love. Why? Because many of us have not had generational wisdom handed down to us or role models who could convince us otherwise. Data suggests that premarital sex is rampant in most church-going populations. What is my point? There are immediate consequences to premarital sexual activity that are deceiving, undermining, and that inhibit the building of trust prior to the marital union. For instance, when a man acts in self-disciplined ways and takes the lead in celibacy, it sends a message to the woman that he can resist temptation, delay immediate gratification, and make unselfish decisions for the common good of their relationship. If he executes that plan perfectly until the wedding day, he can build a wealth of trust that solidifies security in the relationship with his prospective wife. On the other hand, if a woman thinks her partner is impulsive and undisciplined, she will erect a tower to watch over him, lean into suspicions, monitor women around him, analyze his words closely, second-guess him, but most glaringly, never put her complete trust in him to lead her. Women want to be desired by the man they love, so they often consent to premarital sex, but this unfortunately triggers the building of that tower to guard their relationship. When a man cannot exercise self-control, it sends a nonverbal cue to a woman that her partner cannot be trusted, so she carves out an equitable role for herself as a leader in the relationship. It's not uncommon to hear women refer to men as weak or hear a group of women say they're all the same, which is coded communication that dog whistles the idea of men's failings. Conversely, a man who acts wisely is self-disciplined and does not face this level of scrutiny once the vows are exchanged, if he has proven himself to be loyal during the courtship. Astonishingly, wisdom is in short supply. One reason wisdom is lacking today is that there is no widely accepted working definition of it in our culture that is valued enough in our families and among our peers to be passed down from one generation to the next. On the other hand, there is no shortage of knowledge in the world. Artificial intelligence has guaranteed that by providing answers at our fingertips, people in our culture today value knowledge over wisdom, not because knowledge is more valuable or better in some way, but because they simply don't know the difference between the two. While knowledge is on full display in this world and showcased in advancements in the sciences, arts, and technology, wisdom is different. Wisdom is timeless. Wisdom comes from God. Accordingly, we do not see much wisdom in the world today because people have to make an effort in going directly to God himself to obtain it. James chapter 1, verse 5. Knowledge is so much easier to obtain because it bypasses going directly to God. But knowledge is inferior to wisdom because it is hollow and lacks the substance of divine breath. Never substitute knowledge where you should be applying wisdom. If you do not know the difference, take note of something I learned from my late pastor. My pastor had a metaphor he frequently used to describe the difference between wisdom and knowledge. He said, knowledge is the engine in a car, but wisdom is the steering wheel. In a marriage, wisdom brings a man home every night to a Proverbs 31 wife without distraction. Even more, the application of wisdom supplies a wife with great insights into the mind of her husband, such as, it is better to dwell in a corner of the housetop than with a brawling woman in a wide house. Proverbs chapter 21, verse 9. The second reason, which we alluded to earlier regarding why wisdom is in short supply, can be summed up in 7 words. People don't read and study the Bible. Understandably, the most obvious person in this category lacking wisdom is someone who does not believe in God. However, there are people who read their Bible cognitively but never study, memorize, meditate on, quote, rely on, live or speak from it. There is a person who reads only to form vague summations in their mind that are difficult to apply in real-world practical applications. Before we move forward, let me disclose that I am aware of long-term loving marriages without all of the God-centered guidance, aids of wisdom, and Bible scripture application that I've been discussing so far. Yet, they have managed to survive and thrive. The opposite is true as well. Christian married couples who seem to have all the spiritual aids in place frequently fail in their vows. Nothing is foolproof unless it is ordained by the Lord to be so. Even among unbelievers, the omniscient God has traced out a purpose for all lives. While our God is the one who ultimately knows all the hidden variables that will determine the success or failure of a marriage, it would be wise for us to avoid being haphazard. Our thirst for immediate gratification has broken marriages in this country. We can forbid marrying today because, in a practical sense, we can make accommodations for ourselves that do not require the 24/7 presence of a committed partner. Since Adam's eviction from the Garden of Eden, the roles of women have evolved over millennia, and today they procure their own financial means through careers. In addition, they have built their own perches of independence that permit them to position themselves ideally to meet financially established, well-educated men taller than themselves, without children, who have already gone out into the world and established their own gardens. I am using the word garden loosely as a catch-all term that encompasses making a living, earning income, and pursuing a career. The two-garden solution is the most desirable today, but it does not resemble the original institution of marriage in a garden that God designed. It is desirable because women are not setting their ambitions on being complementarian partners or housewives. Instead, they are planting and cultivating their own gardens independently of men for whom they expect men, at the very least, to have established their own gardens. This is a desirable starting point for most modern relationships because it provides a fail-safe. So if the parties become disagreeable, they can leave the relationship without harm while remaining strong and independent. Eve Love was never going to be a woman who would submit to being a helper with me in my garden. She was never going to be a girlfriend, a complementarian partner, or a housewife who waited on me. Let's take it to an extreme. Even if I had become as famous and successful as Eve Love had been, the best possible relationship I could have hoped for with her would have been an intersecting arrangement of a marriage. Recall, I waited for her the first night at the industry party. That waiting would have been my future had I stayed that course. Many years ago, I attempted to tell my starry-eyed, overly romanticizing friend Starla that in a marriage there is more required than love. That sounds harsh to people of my generation who grew up in a society proliferating with romantic novels and comedy movies. Wise men and women know that in the world, the agape love of God saves and secures a marriage. In the garden, romantic love was not the basis or guiding principle behind God's pairing of Adam and Eve. Adam had a loneliness that God fulfilled for him, but his aloneness was not exclusively a romantic void. Adam needed a complementing soul in the garden, in the way the Lord had made arrangements for the animals in the garden, to be paired male and female. Whether in the garden or after the garden, this arrangement was to remain intact. Let that sink in for a moment. However, romantically is how people usually start relationships in this country. A reread of the Genesis 2 narrative reveals that the animals God created functioned with a mate. Adam and Eve's marriage was an arrangement performed by God alone. Don't cringe, but marriage was an arrangement around functions God had commanded in the garden that also included intimate, sensual love in the command to be fruitful and multiply. When I talk to couples who want to get married, I explicitly tell them that there is more function in a marriage than gestures of love. If you respect that principle, you have a chance of having something special because before and after you romance each other, someone has to take out the garbage. Someone has to wash the dishes. Someone has to clean the shower, vacuum the carpet, cut the lawn, change the linen on the bed, sweep the porch, shop for groceries, pay the bills, go to work, wash the clothes, cook meals, replace light bulbs, call the plumber, get the oil changed on the car, read and sort the mail, leave out for work early because they have a meeting. And when you add children to the mix, the functions increase exponentially. There are more functions than gestures of romantic love in a marriage. So we should be careful not to become too starry-eyed. Marriages often end in divorce due to disillusionment with behavior and a lack of vision for the future together. Infidelity is the behavior of others who are undisciplined and prone to immediate gratification. Lies, adultery, poor communication skills, deceit, inattentiveness, poor diets that contribute to becoming overweight, financial irresponsibility, gambling habits, and pornography consumption are factors that have the power to break up the marital union. I have known Christian people who were dating who have gone on vacation together but never declared celibacy as their non-negotiable deal breaker if violated. It always looked suspicious, and very few of us are inclined to say anything to challenge them because either we have our own guilty past or we take comfort in the possibility that this couple might get married and we don't want to be the person who says something that jeopardizes their chances. Culturally, through our own self-deceptions and failings, we are in an ambiguous position about how to pass along pearls of wisdom to the next generation about bringing glory to God through dating. For the most part, as a culture, we no longer see value in arranged marriages, so we avoid seeking out parental or wise advice from someone who could genuinely help us. Unfortunately, we have diminished the way we evaluate a marital partner to using mostly our feelings to evaluate the other person, which is antithetical to our faith relationship with God. Nonetheless, to the glory of God, when we celebrate the wisdom of celibacy before we get married, we have the most amazing opportunity to observe how our potential spouse functions under stress, adversity, obstacles, and challenges. We should at all costs avoid wasting marital love on someone who does not function well. We should also avoid the delusion of entering a marriage based solely on romantic love, as it will only lead to more self-deception. Trust in the counsel that says wisdom will never deceive you. Choose it and avoid the shortcuts of a fool.